Theresa May was saying that no deal was better than a bad deal. She's now trying to say to people that we either have to accept her bad deal or face the prospect of a no deal. That's not true. There are other options. There's the option, the compromise option that the Scottish Government has proposed for the last couple of years of staying permanently inside the single market and customs union, or of course the option of another vote. And what I've said very clearly is that if the opposition in the House of Commons is going to vote down that deal, and it looks likely, and I think that's right, because it's a bad deal for Scotland, a bad deal for the UK, then we also have the obligation and the responsibility to come together around an alternative, and the SNP will certainly play its part in it.
Okay, and your alternative, you've made clear, would be staying in the single market and a customs union, a kind of Norway plus deal, as you put it. Can you give Theresa May a commitment now that the SNP would vote for a Norway plus deal if she put it on the table?
Well, we've said all along that we would support as a compromise, and let me stress that it's not our preferred position. Our preferred position is to remain in the EU, but we said all along that if that compromise was on the table, we would support it. But instead of trying to reach compromise, Theresa May has insisted on imposing on herself red lines that have constrained her options. Of course, there is also the option of another vote. Theresa May is touring the country right now, not spending very long in any one place, as we saw in your film. But if she wants the electorate to judge this deal to be the people of the country, then perhaps she should give them a vote on the matter.
Well, it's
she
interesting.
Seems to be very reluctant to do that.
Well, it's interesting that you're so keen on a second vote, because if you won a referendum on Scottish independence, you'd surely think it was outrageous if then your opponent said, let's put it back to the people for another vote.
Well, you know, the fact of the matter is circumstances have changed in the last 2 years. Whatever people voted for in 2016, they didn't vote for the chaos that we are now seeing and now experiencing. The government has failed to get its act together. It's failed to negotiate a deal that is in the interests of the country. And if Parliament can't agree that deal, then it is reasonable to look again at the principle of whether the UK should leave the EU or remain within the EU.
And if there was, and wait a minute, if there was chaos after a Scottish independence referendum, a couple of years after that, would you be content to see that put back to the people?
Well, you see, there's a real contrast here that it's very obvious for people between the Scottish independence referendum of 2014 and the Brexit vote of 2016. In 2016, we had the infamous lie on the side of a bus. In 2014, we had a 800-plus page document setting out the detail of Scottish independence, setting out very honestly and frankly some of the compromises and trade-offs that would require to be made. For example, a currency union that not everybody agreed with. So we were upfront and honest about some of the implications of Scottish independence. People knew what they were voting for.
Well, and Theresa May would say,
and that is very, very different from the Brexit vote in 2016.
Theresa May would say she's put out nearly as many pages on her deal, and yet you want to stay in a single market and a customs union, and you want to leave the common fisheries policy. I mean, aren't you, just like Boris Johnson, guilty of wanting to have your cake and eat it?
Well, of course, EFTA countries that are in the single market and not in the EU are not in the common fisheries policy, but in that deal that Theresa May struck at the weekend, I mean, clearly the way is being paved for another sellout of Scottish fishermen. But you talked about the hundreds of pages of the withdrawal deal, and there's lots in that, of course, to pore over. But the document that tells us what the future relationship between the UK and the EU is going to be amounts to 26 pages. There's a line in it that says there's a spectrum of options for the future. Voting for this in the House of Commons for MPs would be voting for a blindfold Brexit. It would be voting to leave the EU come the 29th of March next year without any idea at all of what the future relationship is going to be. Of course, what we see from the analysis published today is that all of these options, when the UK leaves the EU, if the UK leaves the EU, will make the country poorer. So Theresa May has failed. She's failed to bring back a deal that can unite people and that can attract support. And I think it is now time for her to look at the alternatives. And if she won't do it, the House of Commons should force her to.
Okay, no deal is worst for the UK. The Bank of England and the Treasury made that clear today. But actually, you could argue it's best for the SNP, because the chaos that would come out of a no deal would enable you to justify a second independence referendum, wouldn't it?
Well, you see, this is where, I have to say I'm very different from Boris Johnson, because I don't agree with that cynical approach to politics. I don't want to see the UK damage itself. I don't want to see that for its own sake. But equally, whatever the constitutional future of Scotland turns out to be, and I hope and expect that will be as an independent country, it's always going to be in Scotland's interest for the rest of the UK to succeed, for the rest of the UK to have as close as possible a relationship with the European Union. So in all sincerity, I've put forward compromise options over the last couple of years with the best interest, not just of Scotland, but with the whole UK at heart. And what we found in those 2 years is that Theresa May has been unwilling to listen. She comes to Scotland today, but she has ignored completely Scotland's voice over these past couple of years, ignored the 62% vote to remain, and ignored all attempts at compromise, and in doing so actually has immeasurably strengthened the case for Scotland to be an independent country.
Okay, I'd love to ask you when, but we've run out of time. First Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jackie.
Well, our political